Back in the 1960s, I was on number 16 squadron at RAF Laarbach in northern Germany. And at that time, because we were NATO, it was the policy of every allied nation to send aircraft to all the other bases so that NATO could be completely interoperable, which is a great word. So, in other words, we had aircraft come from Denmark, from Norway, Belgium, Holland, even France, I think, on occasions, the American Air Force and the German Air Force. So we all flew and occasionally landed at another base so that the ground crew could have an opportunity to do a turnaround on an aircraft with which they were not familiar. And on this particular day, Dudley Brown and Manav were tasked to go down into southern Germany and to a German Air Force base called Fürstenfeldbruck, which I think is down near Munich. And it was a lovely day, and we had a great trip down there. Got down there roughly about lunchtime, I suppose. And we were out at the aircraft while the ground crew were doing the refueling and the turnaround. And we're looking at the maps to check our route on the way back. And while we were doing this, there was a little utility, it was like a German version of a Jeep. I think it must have been a sort of cut-down Volkswagen, with a guy driving it. Now, the guy was in his mid to late 50s. He was wearing an open neck shirt, Luftwaffe blue trousers, no tie, no rank badges, and a forage cap. And he said, "Would you like to come for a coffee?" And we said, "Oh, love to," he said, thinking he was just a driver. So we got in the car, and while we were driving across to the air traffic tower, he was asking us how we liked our time in Germany, and we told him where we'd been and where we'd flown and the places we'd visited, and it was a really good chat, and he was very interested to hear what we were doing. So we got to the air traffic tower, which was a fairly massive three-story building with a big glass house on top. And we didn't go in the front. We drove around to the back of the building, and it was like an iron staircase, some sort of like fire escape staircase. And we went up the staircase, but in the door that was on the second floor of the building. And as we got into this office, and it was a massive office with a big plate glass window that looked out across the airfield. And at that point, we realised he wasn't just the driver, he was the base commander, because on one wall there was this beautiful dress uniform covered in gongs and gold braid and a Luftwaffe hat. And on the other wall, there was a picture, which I'll show you here, I think we can see it. And it's a very famous picture of a Hanko 3 flying over London, over the East India Docks in 1940. And both Dudley and I stopped and looked at that, and we were, quite amazed by it. And at this point, this German guy came up behind us. He said very, very happily, he said, "Yeah," he says, "I too have visited your country," which we thought was quite a tactful way of putting it, really. And we had a great chat about, things about the war. And I wish at that time that I had had the bottle to ask him to send me an autographed picture, because I loved it, but I didn't, unfortunately. And the other thing that came to mind was that he survived the war. And I know that the Luftwaffe during the war, you either quitted when you were either killed or injured so bad you couldn't fly, or you were taken prisoner. And I can only presume that he actually spent some time as a prisoner of war in Britain, which is why he was probably quite so friendly.
So after filming, it occurred to me that we knew that this guy was the station commander at Fürstenfeldbruck in 1967, and that meant somebody somewhere would know who he was. I spoke to a very helpful contact, thanks Steffi, who happens to live in Germany and happens to move in the right circles. And very quickly she came back to me with the answer that the person that Flight Lieutenant Dobz Dobbie had spoken to on that day in 1967 was none other than Oberst Walter Grossermann. Now, Walter was a Luftwaffe bomber pilot during the Second World War. He was involved in something like 420 combat missions, both over Britain and Moscow. He was involved in supply drops out to Stalingrad. And what's fascinating is, as I read more and more about him, I discovered that he'd had at least 2 crash landings. So the first instance that I could find was in June of 1943, and this is where he crash landed a Heinkel 111, which was shot down by a night fighter, and it crashed 2 kilometers northeast of Ludzhinovo. I hope I've pronounced that right, which is somewhere kind of west-southwest of Moscow. And he and his crew were actually very fortunate to land here. I can only assume that they made for German lines. But at that point in 1943, the Eastern Front was not very far to their east, and obviously if they'd crash landed in Russian-occupied territory, we can only assume that they'd have been taken prisoner at best, and perhaps wouldn't have made it at all at worst. So yeah, fortunate to land where they landed. It seems that they recovered quickly. Less than a month later, Walter belly landed another Heinkel 111, and that was at Kharkov Voichenko in Ukraine, after some anti-aircraft fire took out the right aileron. And yeah, so the results of his efforts during the war were that he received a number of awards. He got the Iron Cross both second and first class in 1939. He received the German Cross in Gold in March of 1942. And he also received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross on the 9th of October in 1943. And we can see him receiving that award in this photograph here. And I can only assume that the uniform in the display cabinet included these medals. And to summarise what the awards were for, essentially they were for bravery and leadership in battle. And specifically, the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross was awarded for inflicting heavy destruction on enemy industry, including railway cars and artillery and industrial buildings and airfields. So there we go. He survived the war, and he continued to work in the Luftwaffe, and eventually was posted to Fürstenfeldbruck, where he was the commander of the airbase through to his retirement in March of 1971. And he stayed in Fürstenfeldbruck until he passed away in 2007.